take a second look at some old unresolved murders from the Civil Rights era, and a man from Fairview named Frank Morris, his name is on the list. I had never heard of Frank Morris in my life. So I called the Southern Poverty Law Center, which was instrumental in getting the federal government to take another look at these cases. And they sent me 150 pages of heavily redacted documents. I took that little bit of information I wrote my first story. It was about a little over 700 words. And I really thought, this is interesting, a story, a story from the past. But I really didn't see how I could advance the story. But not long after the story was out, I got a call from Rosa Williams. She was the granddaughter of Frank Morris. She calls and says someone from Fairview sent her a copy of the paper. And she said, I want to thank you for that article. She said, I've learned more about what happened to my grandfather in that one article than I've known in the last 40 plus years. And I found that just hard to believe. How can that be? She said no one from authority ever talked to her, that she had throughout her life wondered what happened to her grandfather. She said, I want to know who did it, but more than anything else, I want to know why they did it. What could be possible have done for someone to want to kill him in that way?
Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Christopher Drew. I'm a professor at LSU's Banship School of Mass Communication, and I run the LSU Cold Case Project. This is my predecessor, Jay Shelley. He created our Cold Case Project to help Stanley with his work. Most of us have a moment in life when something happens, and we can either step up or we can ignore the call. What you just heard in that video was Stanley Nelson. That was his moment. And we're all gathered here because of the inspiring way that he responded. Stanley didn't stop after that first story about Frank Morris, who was killed when his shoe shop was firebombed. He heeded Rosa Williams' call. He wrote 150 stories over the next 4 years about planned murders. He teamed up with all the outstanding journalists on the stage today. His work enabled the Morris family and the Wallace Jackson and O'Neill Moore families who are here today to learn who had killed their loved ones and why. And he helped train our students to carry on his work. You'll hear more about all this today and how the life of this small town weekly newspaper editor in Louisiana merited obituaries in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and on National Public Radio. We'll start with Hank Libanoff, a Pulitzer Prize winning author, who has also won several major awards for a Cold Case podcast series, Buried Truth. He runs Georgia's Civil Rights Cold Cases Project at Emory University, and he worked closely with Stanley when Hank helped run a Cold Case Project for the Center for Investigative Reporting, a nonprofit news group. Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. If you can't hear me at some point, so go like this, or if I start screaming, go like this. It's an honor to be here. Yes, there's some pleasure in it, but boy, there's just a lot of sadness in this. And yet I do this knowing that when I can hear Stanley's voice over my shoulders, it's worth it. I've had the privilege in the last week to listen to some old interviews I did with him, and it just lifted my spirits. I can't tell you much about the first time I met Stanley. I'm sure it was at a gathering of civil rights cold case journalists, and somewhere on some southern turf, we've been pulled together by Robert Rosenthal, Rosie to many of us, and his team at the Center for Investigative Reporting out in the Bay Area. And he was prepared to put together some seed funding for us to get started looking at some of these civil rights cold cases. I saw some amazing journalists as I looked around me those couple of days. People, you know, there were a lot of outsized personalities, brassy storytellers, healthy egos, all of whom had proved that they belonged in this pantheon. I remember all of them, except for one, and that's the friend and colleague who we're here to honor tonight, Stanley Nelson, editor of a weekly newspaper, the Concordia Sentinel, and he was the most inconspicuous person in the group. And he was about to become the most auspicious member of the group. Stanley was among a few reporters who had asked the Center for Investigative Reporting to support what they were doing, their work. And Rosie, in turn, called me. I'm from Alabama. I had worked at the Mississippi newspaper for 6 years. I'd worked at the Boston Globe, actually with Rosie for 3 years, and then followed him to the Philadelphia Inquirer, where I stayed for 20 years, and then the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for 6 years. So he knew I had some experience. He said, hey, look, Hank, look, I need help. This is Rosie. He said, I need to tell you about some journalists in the South who are doing some work on the civil rights cold cases. He says, and they've come to me for help. I'm on the West Coast. As you know, I'm from Scarsdale, New York. I don't know anything about the South, so I need somebody who does. And that was in June of 2008. And I had just left the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and I was ready to jump in. And so I did. Stanley was deep at that time in the throes of a huge, complex, but little-known running story. When I say running story, I mean he was going at it every day, okay? And publishing stories every week. This was a weekly newspaper he was working for, mind you. And he was pushing to the Sentinel's front page, bold and revealing stories week after week about the racially motivated murder of Frank Morris, who owned a shoe repair shop in Faraday. And Stanley was receptive to having someone serving as a sounding board, as a consulting editor, and as a line editor. So the scores of conversations that Stanley and I had, sometimes 6 and 7 times a week, and I mean for hours at a time sometimes. And then they were long conversations and they were late, partly because I had to learn and remind myself Stanley had a job beyond this. He was covering the Drainage Commission. He was covering the police jury. He had all the responsibilities of a weekly newspaper in Louisiana, and all this was on top of that, okay? And so we would talk for long hours. Many conversations were by phone and began with the sound of Stanley shuffling his notebook, and turning pages, looking for something. And finally, he says, say, Hank, I think I found something. Tell me what you think. And that's how I knew that he had found another mind-boggling piece of information that we were going to be writing about, or he was to be writing about, and I was just going to be saying, Lord, Stanley, you just don't quit, do you? Single-handedly, week after week, in the cases of Frank Morris, Wallace Jackson, and Joed Edwards, Stanley uncovered more leads, more witnesses, more documents, and more information than the FBI had about the 3 civil rights murders in the Faraday, Natchez area. In more than 150 stories that he produced from about 2007 to 2011, the reports churned out by this one-man investigative squad provided FBI agents with leads they did not have, with names they did not know, and with documents they did not realize they already had in their possession. and he did it quietly, steadily, with total integrity. Even when going for a confrontation interview, Stanley approached people slowly, face to face, hands out of his pockets, and notebook closed. He was without guile, without pretense, or any thought of an ambush interview. His goal was to avoid a one-and-done interview. He always was confident that he could walk away with an invitation to return and continue that conversation with someone who had no reason in the world to talk with him, because it was just going to end up in the newspaper. In the flurry of all of this, the Columbia Journalist Review, as part of a periodic feature they did about the story gathering techniques of great journalists, asked me to interview Stanley, download him into my brain, and write my findings in his voice. Sounds a tad twisted, I know, but not when you have Stanley to work with. I would later write about him. He is a master of the art of source development, a steady, slow-cooked process that relies on being there, seeing people day after day, building personal relationships, treating people fairly, and ultimately parlaying that information into news stories that serve his readers. Stanley has built his newspaper's credibility and his own reputation by putting what he learns and what he vets in the paper. I call it Stanley's style.
Let's just kind of do a hand on this. That's just the way I would talk to anybody about anything. I try not to be correcting in any manner, or I just want people to relax because I think they talk better. I know I do. I know somebody approaches me in just a nice, non-threatening way. I'm be much more open to talk about something as serious as what I want to talk to them about.
As part of his straightforward but gentle way of approaching people, Stanley's portrayals of victims and perpetrators became full portraiture. He learned that Frank Morris earns his clientele by treating everyone, black and white, kindly, and by providing skilled labor to a poor community where parents weren't buying new shoes every year or every season for their children. Frank Morris won friends by extending the lives of their family's shoes, saving them money, and by inviting their curious children, black and white, behind the counter to watch him operate the whirling machines that cut or reinforced leather belts, replaced a heel, or strengthened a vamp. And this was in the 1940s and 50s, when, as you probably, many of us can remember, blacks and whites did not mingle together too often inside businesses like that. As a writer, Stanley used all these details to bring his readers into the shop. One I'll never forget. Frank Morris, seeing the nervous wife of a hostile Klansman drive up to the shoe repair shop and would walk out so she could hand over her shoes through the car window without having to get out and risk being seen. This was the Gothic South, where Stanley was raised by parents who steered him away from hate, away from bullying, away from taunting or anything resembling violence. Frank Morris was much the same way. When the deputy sheriff in Concordia Parish, Frank Delard, bullied Frank Morris into shining his shoes and keeping them in good repair, always for free. Frank Morris went along with it for a while, but before too long, Frank Morris summoned the courage to remind the deputy sheriff that he was a professional at what he did. He did fine work with boots for a living, and the deputy sheriff was going to have to pay just like everybody else. The deputy sheriff's rage may have been what led to Frank Morris's horrific death, when a group of gangster Klansmen from another town, a wrecking crew, as Stanley so aptly described it, showed up at night at Morris's shop and home, sloshed gasoline across the floor, lit a match, and watched as Stanley ran in a frenzy into the night, his clothes and then his flesh all aflame. For months, the FBI ignored Stanley's findings. They didn't interview their own former agents who had investigated the cases when they were fresh, as Stanley had done. They didn't pursue interviews with witnesses, former Klan informants, and aging people who were intimately involved in the events that led to the killings, all of which Stanley had painstakingly reported. And he had located all of those people. And they flat out rejected help from the sons of a former Ku Klux Klan member and Silver Dollar Group member who were prepared to name leading suspects. Over time, the FBI found itself learning what Stanley was doing simply by purchasing the newspaper. And that Stanley was not going to sit with them and tell them everything that he was finding out in hopes that they would exchange information back. Agents began suggesting to Stanley that perhaps he should collaborate with them. But he knew from experience that meant he'd tell them what he knew and they'd share nothing back with him. Stanley projected trust, and he genuinely had a deep reservoir of trust in his heart. But even Stanley had his limits. He was not a cynic, but he was a skeptic. I asked him about that.
Yeah, because I think nobody's beyond question, even me. And so things have to be proven to you. You know, one thing that they said to us that I was certainly suspicious to, I remember one of them said, you just have to trust us.
Who, one of them being
Either the FBI or somebody who just
Right.
but they said you just have to trust us. And you know, I think, that's an awful lot to ask.
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean, I could just say, well, tell me, you just have to trust me and tell me what I want to know. Just trust me. I don't think that's going to help you.
I really loved that laugh at Stanley. We understood exactly what he meant. It's worth all of us of a certain generation to remember those early years with the way Stanley did what he did as a newspaper reporter. He recalled he had to take pictures, he had to learn how to develop them in the darkroom. He'd answer phones. He'd wait on customers at the front counter, take their subscription money, give them a receipt. He'd sell ads if he had a buyer. Best of all, he told me, those early years offered him plenty of opportunities to focus on writing. Here's how Stanley put it. How can you miss when you get a call about an old man who 30 years after he carved the date and his initials into the shell of a terrapin, sees that same turtle crawling back across his lawn again 30 years later. And he's like, that's always great. That's a page one story. Okay? Of course you have to follow that up. And the only difference between Stanley and me is the way he told that story. He said, sees that same turtle crawling across the lawn again, and I would tell him by saying, sees that same damn turtle crawling across the lawn again. So sometime late in 2010, Jay Shelby, who you've met, you'll hear more from the Mansion School and creator of the LSU Cold Case Project, called me. Jay's phenomenal specialty was in deploying students to flood the FBI and DOJ and National Archives with Freedom of Information requests for records on civil rights cold cases. He'd been feeding Stanley stacks of records and was awestruck by the stories Stanley and his students were producing. You know what, said Jay. we have to nominate Stanley for a Pulitzer Prize. There was a long silence as I was trying to take all that in, and finally it struck me that no truer words had ever been uttered. Of course Stanley was worthy of a Pulitzer Prize. Did it matter that weekly newspaper editors win Pulitzer Prizes next to never? Good Lord, no. Let's do it. When the 2011 Pulitzers were announced, Stanley was one of the 3 finalists in America. The winner in the local investigative reporting category, by the way, was the Chicago Sun-Times. Stanley, as I've said, was a one-man operation with an entire staff of 3 reporters, including himself. I did a little checking around, and guess what? The Chicago Sun-Times had more than 3 reporters just on its investigative team that won the Pulitzer Prize that year. So, to even imagine Stanley in that league, well, he couldn't imagine himself in that league. Since 1979, I've had the great pleasure and fortune to work with and for many Pulitzer Prize winners at the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Boston Globe, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Research for a book that I co-wrote with legendary editor Gene Roberts, The Race Beat, The Press, The Civil Rights Struggle, and The Awakening of a Nation, which itself won a Pulitzer Prize in history, allowed me to meet and write about some of the most extraordinary journalists of the 20th century. And I have to tell you, Stanley was and is in their league. He just didn't know it. And if he did know it, he wasn't going to let himself believe it. He was just going to keep going and keep going. Unlike many of those journalists, Stanley brought the added value, this is really important, of being attuned to the standards and expectations of his community. He may have reflected the values of Concordia Parish, Louisiana, but he did not feel compelled to mimic them. In this case, the newspaper has had to exhibit leadership and courage in pursuing a story that many of its readers believed should be left alone. The newspaper did it for their readers, but they also did it because they trusted Stanley, as we all did. God bless you, Stanley Nelson. I want to introduce you now to someone I had the great fortune of meeting one day when I was teaching a class, visited a class at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I don't know, she may tell us more about this, but she just came up to me later and was interested in the Civil Rights Cold Cases Project and looking for a way to get into it, okay? I can tell you, she's done extremely well since then. She hasn't stayed with journalism, but she has gone on to law. She went to Yale Law School, and she's now a lawyer in Washington, D.C., after having clerked the Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. This is Tori Stillwell.
Okay, I'll be a little louder. Thank you. So I'm happy to be following Hank in this program because, as he just described to you, he is the reason that Stanley was a part of my life, a big part of my life. He was a visiting lecturer in my journalism classes after having recently published his book, and he had come to speak with the class about investigative reporting and his work with the collective of journalists who were looking into unsolved killings from the civil rights era. So my interest was piqued, and I was painfully aware that I needed a summer internship that summer, and so I reached out to Hank to ask if I could help with the project. That would fit in the summer of 2010. And Hank gave it a think and introduced me to Stanley via email, who he said had some promising work going on out of the newspaper in the Concordia Sentinel. And in characteristic Stanley fashion, Stanley welcomed me with open arms to a place that I'd never even heard of, let alone been. He helped me find summer housing in Natchez, which is no small feat, and he eased the concerns of my mother, who was also somewhat hesitant to have her daughter so far from home for the summer. That summer ended up being a pivotal chapter in both my life and Stanley's, cementing his legacy as a powerhouse in the field of investigative journalism. Leading up to my arrival at the Concordia Sentinel, and with the support of the paper's owners, Stanley had been investigating the murder of Frank Morris, who you all know by now was the owner of a shoe shop in town. Shortly after my arrival that summer, Stanley gave me a driving tour of Verity and showed me the cement stump of Morris's shoe shop and filled me in on the details of the murder as we drove around. He later told me that he felt that his work had produced a suspect in the murder, which had long gone unsolved. We came up with a plan for Stanley to approach that suspect, Leonard Spencer, along with two other collaborators in the Center for Investigative Reporting Civil Rights Cold Case Project, filmmaker David Kearney and cameraman Dan McKay. Somewhat to my surprise, Stanley insisted that I come along. I remember feeling a mix of emotions, certainly excitement and gratitude that Stanley would include me in such a climactic moment of his story. I was honored that Stanley would trust me to be there for what would be an important moment in his career. But also, I was a little scared. To state the obvious, I was a black 19-year-old young woman, and we were going to approach someone who was not only a member of the Klan, but an allegedly murderous one. Moreover, as a point of professional interest, surely my presence would not help such a man open up to Stanley. Couldn't my being there hurt the investigation? Stanley handled each of my emotions with care and sincerity, and from the relative safety of the van that we drove over in, I watched as Stanley approached Spencer on the porch of his home. And I remember thinking that Stanley was truly uniquely situated to do this work. Far from some uninvested journalist from a big city paper, Stanley was a reporter with deep ties to the area, and he approached his work with the same care and sincerity that he showed me. Watching him conduct interviews, I saw how Stanley disarmed his subjects with kindness, and how his knowledge of those times and its players helped people more easily access their own memories. But his courtesy could never be mistaken for timidity. Stanley was fearless in his search for the truth. I witnessed that in his interview with Leonard Spencer that day. Stanley placed himself in danger, approaching Spencer on his home turf at the end of a long lane through a cornfield. During the interview, Spencer was vaguely threatening, saying, quote, "I know it's more to this than what you're telling me. I'm not stupid." At the end of the interaction, when Stanley reached out to shake Spencer's hand, Stanley later recalled that Spencer squeezed it so hard that he almost asked him to ease up. Stanley placed himself in harm's way for the sake of his stories, but he did not do so for glory or recognition. He did so because it was right. The entire time I knew Stanley, he felt deeply connected to the families of the victims of the cold case murders he was investigating, and he was honored to play a part in their pursuit of justice. Where others dropped the ball in righting these wrongs, Stanley picked it up and ran with it. In doing so, Stanley became a hero to more people in history. After he took me in that summer, Stanley and his family became an extension of my own. As often as we could, Stanley and I would trade updates me halfway when I found myself in New Orleans. He attended my graduations from UNC and later from Yale Law School. He officiated my wedding to my husband, Brandon, who is here today. Stanley's grandson, Seth, videoed our ceremony on our handheld camera. And when I got pregnant with our first child, Stanley was so excited. I think he had asked when we would start growing our family more often than my own mom did. Drawing from his own experience, Stanley felt that family is one of life's greatest gifts, and he couldn't wait to meet my son, who was born in late June. 2 days before he passed, Stanley sent me a photo of the home that he shared with Nancy. He wrote, "This is now my home. Nancy has a green thumb. The house is great. The old screen doors creak and whine when they are opened." Aware that my due date was approaching, Stanley also said to me, "This is a big month, and I'm constantly thinking about you. I want to talk soon." Stanley well knew that I was nervous about motherhood, and I wrote back that I wasn't feeling ready for it. Stanley's last words to me were ones of reassurance and optimism. "I know," he said, "but oh, the joy to come." Thank you. And with that, I'm introducing Jim Shapiro, who is a longtime NPR correspondent.
So I'm Joe Shapiro from NPR, and I think I'd like to start by playing a piece of an appreciation of Stanley that I did on NPR in June. On that list of unsolved murders, the name that bothered Stanley Nelson the most was Frank Morris. For white people like Nelson in Faraday, Louisiana, a little town across the Mississippi River from Natchez, it was forgotten history. That in darkness on December 10th, 1964, a gang of Ku Klux Klansmen showed up with guns and gasoline and murdered Morris, burned alive in his shoe repair store on the main road through town.
All of my life, I passed by this shop. Didn't know.
In 2011, Nelson took me to what was left, just a faint outline in concrete and bricks. After months of reporting, Nelson had just published a story naming the last living member of the gang that Nelson said killed Frank Morris. That man denied it, but Nelson had good sources, the man's ex-wife and a son.
I always tell people about planning, particularly the roughest ones. If your daddy was going out at night, burning buildings down, kidnapping and torturing people, doing everything bad that you can think of, they probably weren't too nice at home either. And they weren't.
Some of Nelson's best sources on his many cold case investigations turned out to be the spouses and children who'd been abused by those Klansmen too. Nelson wrote 2 books and article after article. He taught his methods to students at LSU. In the days before he died, Nelson told me he was excited because he thought he found the spot where Joseph Edwards, the man in another unsolved murder, was buried.
People always ask me, what did you do this for?
In 2018, Nelson talked about his work at a Rotary Club meeting in Louisiana.
These type of incidents, unsolved murders, the lack of justice last in communities forever. And if you don't address them, if you don't figure out what happened, if you don't figure out why it happened, these things will live on forever.
There's a small group of journalists who do this work, which gets harder as time passes, memories cloud, witnesses die. Jerry Mitchell's reporting led to several convictions, including the killer of civil rights leader Medgar Evers. Mitchell says it was hard at times for Nelson because he was also the editor of a small-town newspaper. Many subscribers didn't want that history told.
The thing about Stanley is you could just write 1 or 2 stories and then move on. He continued to write about it. It began to change over time, hearts and minds. By the end of the day, you have the city honoring Frank Morris.
Last December, on the 60th anniversary of the killing of Frank Morris, the city of Faraday acknowledged that difficult history and held a ceremony to honor him. Morris's granddaughter and great-granddaughter attended with Stanley Nelson as witnesses to truth and to justice. Joseph Shapiro, NPR News.
I was in the newsroom at the Concordia Sentinel that day that the Frank Morris story published, and I was asked to talk about what I remembered about that day. And the thing that I remember most is how calm Stanley was, his cold-headedness. The last minutes before you publish a story or a paper in a newsroom, those are chaotic moments. You're making last-minute checks and fixes and changes. And that morning in January, in the newsroom in Faraday, the Concordia Sentinel, it was chaos. The layout designer that morning, she was driving to work and she saw a house was on fire. She grabs her camera and she takes a picture of firemen pulling an elderly woman out of this burning house. And by the way, the house was up like a block from where Frank Morris had died. And then word came that that elderly woman had died. So right before the deadline, that small staff, as I remember, that small staff they were scrambling to write the story, and they were ripping up the front page because this was the important story of the day. And in the original layup, Stanley's investigative report was across the top with a big display, and now it's been pushed down. It's got a smaller display, and no journalist likes that. You've done a big story, you've done all this work, and this was a big story at a small paper that was going to get national attention. So that hurts. But Stanley was totally fine. He was totally cool about all this. And in fact, he was the one that was calling everyone else, including some of his best sources. Brenda Rose, the ex-wife of Leonard Spencer, the Landsman, was on the phone. She was already getting phone calls from reporters around the country. And she wanted to know, what do I say? And Stanley tells her, he says, you don't have to say anything. And then the night before, Stanley spent at least 2 hours on the phone with Leonard Spencer's son, Boo, who was worried because he named his father, and it was going to come out in the paper. And Stanley quoted scripture to the son, Proverbs. The man who is laden with the guilt of human blood will be a fugitive until death. Let no one support him. One thing that made Stanley such a journalist and person was the way that he connected with people. And you heard in my story talk about that somebody, a classman who would terrorize and kill and torture someone would also be someone who would terrorize members of his own family. So, and Stanley had all this respect for all the people who were his sources. He spent hours and hours listening to Boo. And he listened to the stories about how Leonard Spencer hit and abused his own kids. And Stanley listened to Boo's resentments towards his father. But Stanley also understood why 2 days after that story published, Boo called his father to wish Leonard Spencer happy birthday and say, I love you. So that day in the newsroom, I remember, it was just buzzing. There were reporters calling. I just showed up. I got stuck in Memphis in an ice storm. I just showed up. There were some last-minute changes to the story in the editorial. They got another comment from Leonard Spencer. One reason, by the way, I wanted to do these stories was that I started my reporting career in 1978 in Mississippi, reporting on civil rights fights and protests and writing about the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. The other thing I was asked to talk about was what was the reaction of the black community when this story published? And I can't speak for the community, but I can make some observations. And I was thinking of my former colleague at NPR, Michelle Norris, who was the host of All Things Considered. She wrote a memoir called The Grace of Silence. And she wrote about how she grew up in Minneapolis, but she never knew the full story of why her father had left Alabama all those years before. And no one in her family talked about what happened to her father at the end of World War II. Just 2 weeks after he'd been discharged from the Navy, about how he went home to Alabama, and the policeman in Birmingham, who saw this black man in his Navy uniform, picked a fight and shot him in the leg. No one ever told Michelle about that, about how black men who came back from World War II across the South were seen as a threat to the social order, to the rules of Jim Crow. And so Michelle and Morris talk about the grace of silence, the idea that there's this narrow line to be negotiated. Yes, you want to acknowledge the wrongs of the past. You crave justice. Justice that you know may never come. But there's also a burden to carry that anger. Michelle's parents wanted to protect her. They wanted to protect themselves. They didn't want her to be stuck in the past. They wanted her to keep, they didn't want her to lose faith in better possibilities, to keep moving forward. Stanley and I did a story together about another killing, the killing of John Queen in Fayette, Mississippi. And I ended my story for NPR with a scene where I'm at a nursing home. And Stanley and I have found John Queen's great niece, a woman named Shirley Cool. And she says, you know, John Queen, he was just a black man in the 60s, and who cared about a black man in the 60s? No justice was given to him. And Stanley and I went and we interviewed her. She died just a few weeks later. And that day when we were there in the nursing home interviewing her, her daughter and her grandson were there. And the grandson, they're listening to our interview with the grandson. He's 18, he's stunned. He just graduated from high school. I think he was at the Adams Christian School in Fayette. And he says, you know, in school we studied Mississippi history. We read about Medgar Evers. We read about Emmett Till. But this is the first time I've ever heard about this history in my own family. Which gets back to why Stanley's legacy is so lasting. You know, the day the story about Leonard Spencer and Frank Morris came out, Stanley told me, he said, I've been working on this story for 4 years. We may not have another 4 years to tell these stories. Suspects are dying, witnesses are dying, we're running out of time. Which is why he invited so many of us to collaborate, and it's why he taught students at LSU to do this work, and why he kept going and patiently turning up detail after detail, and dedicated himself to trying to find some justice to address these wrongs. You know, I was just writing out some of these thoughts yesterday. I so much wanted to call Stanley and talk to him and talk to him about some of these people that we met. And I miss him. I know he won't.
Jerry Mitchell Jerry Mitchell, professional and personal mission has been centered on justice. In fact, he became a legend as one of the first professionals. Stanley Nelson reached out in the early days of his search for murderers of Faraday businessman Frank Morris. Stanley and Jerry toiled in this region's notorious killing fields, a wide strip of bloody land from Monroe down through Concordia Parish, across the Mississippi to Natchez, and over to Jackson, and southeast to Bogalusa. Jerry left newspapering in 2018 and found and oversee the nonprofit Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting. It is an honor to have the godfather of modern day civil rights investigations before me.
As Stanley did call me that first day he heard the name Frank Morris and asked me if I'd ever heard of him, and I said no. But Stanley sure found out, didn't he? And, wrote hundreds of articles about that. The Silver Dollar Group has already come to talk about. But Stanley pursued these stories, after most people believe they belong to history and not to journalism. But they did belong to journalism because the truth had never been told and justice had never been done. And Stanley did this work, I know, in the face of death threats. He did this work in the face of criticism from people he met at the grocery store and encountered in town who said, "Why are you digging up the past?" And Stanley's favorite reply was, "What would you do if it was one of your loved ones? What would you want to do?" And that usually ended the discussion in terms of the criticism. But the articles that Stanley wrote attracted the attention of Greg Ives, who's another force of nature. And so the two became friends. Stanley, this gentle giant of journalism, and Greg, this kind of bombastic, take no prisoners author, right? And they discovered, just as I have, that much of the land that we live on here in the South has been stained by racial massacres, assassinations, rapes, and senseless murders. And as Stanley put it, the blood of our brothers and sisters cries out from the ground. And that's why he kept going. Unsurprisingly, many of our history books, as people have already kind of alluded to, don't include any references to this. And Merle Evers once said to me, kind of was talking about this, she said, "We keep repeating our history because we don't know our history." And Stanley spent many, many hours with families, listening rapidly to stories long omitted from this history. He knew that the truth had to be told to have justice, but that even if justice proved impossible, the truth could still be told. He never stopped because journalism, above all, is a calling. And if ever there was a man whose life best reflected that calling, it was Stanley Wilson. So Greg started going out with Stanley, and when he conducted interviews, and what he saw was just this natural investigator with an empathetic face, his slow melodic voice, and his near tangible integrity. Stanley would sit across from some former Klansman and draw out secrets a killer had never intended to tell a priest, much less a journalist. And so they went and interviewed former members of the Deacons of Defense. You got to know about them, that basically protected civil rights activists, protected black churches from being burned down, and search for clues in the disappearance of Joed Edwards, who disappeared at the hands of the Silver Dollar Group. But the two developed a real deep friendship, and Greg would call him in the middle of the night. Of course, Greg's hours are, I think, a little different than Stanley's hours were. And be asking about something, what about this, Stanley? What about this? And Stanley is, such an humble, generous guy, would always answer Greg's question. So Greg ended up portraying Stanley in the book Natchez Burning, which became a trilogy. And when I asked Stanley about what he thought about Greg's portrayal of him, he told me, he said that his alter ego lived a much more adventurous life. He said he is a musician, has a girlfriend, and is tech savvy. That's something I don't know a damn thing about. But Greg got one thing unmistakably right. Anyone going to war would want Stanley on his lieutenant because he would be the one willing to take a bullet or fall on a grenade to save the rest of us. Greg called Natchez Burning Trilogy the most important writing he ever did. And he said it would not exist if not for the inspiration and selfless collaboration of Stanley Nelson. I never knew another man who always did the right thing, regardless of fear or favor, not motivated by hope or profit or fame. Stanley eventually gained a wide reputation for excellence, but not because he saw it, because he earned it. And God knows the world is a better place because he lived and worked in it. God bless you, Stanley Nelson. We love you so much. We know your spirit's here with us today. Thank you.
Sam Hanna Jr. is owner of several of the newspapers in northeastern Louisiana, including, and importantly, the Concordia Sentinel. His sister, Leslie Hanna Caprion, is the publisher of the Sentinel. They were Stanley Nelson's bosses during the time he dug for the terrible truths of the past. As a former investigative reporter, newspaper editor, and a publisher, I can attest that we have three heroes before us today. One is being outwardly and deservedly celebrated. The other two have been largely behind the scenes, generally unsung, and deserve some recognition. All three are joined at the professional hip. Stanley Nelson's instincts, love of the hunt, empathy, courage, and commitment could have all been for naught had he not had the support of Sam and Leslie. Newspaper management abandonments in the name of accommodation are all too common in community newspapers today. But Sam Jr. and Leslie Hanna are another breed of man. For one, they carry the right DNA in their families. Their late father, Sam Hanna Sr., is legendary in Louisiana newspaper circles. Secondly, Sam and Leslie had a moral compass accompanying their solid business instincts. They saw Stanley's work as closure for the victims' families and the community as a whole, goals real newspapers take seriously. Having Stanley's back against the establishment criticism is risky. There are no accolades attached, no leaps in circulation, no spikes in advertising, and certainly no bottom line increases. Just drafts of staff and potential financial threats. That's the reward. The Hannas are textbook examples of what the First Amendment and the community journalism are all about. In my eyes, Sam and Leslie are legends in their respective right. Stanley Nelson knew this, and now you do too. So would you stand and please join me in an overdue ovation and appreciation for Sam, who will speak to you in a moment, and Leslie.
Thank you, Jay, for that very generous introduction. And made one mistake. I'm a co-owner of the Concordia Center, and the other was sitting right back there. And along sitting next to Mr. Jim Brown. Everything that you heard today about Stanley is all true. And one thing that I would like to point out, most importantly, what all of you observed or read through the years of Stanley's cold case reporting, quite frankly, didn't surprise me and didn't surprise Leslie, because that's just who Stanley was. He was a journalist, He worked diligently in uncovering the truth, and he was determined to present his findings to his readers in an accurate, straightforward fashion. He wasn't looking for a pat on the back. He wasn't looking for any fanfare. He simply had a job to do, and he did it. He did it very well. I certainly miss him. I can assure you that the Concordia Sentinel misses him. Our readers miss him. And recently I got an email from the Manship School about a new crop of inductees into the Manship School Hall of Fame. And though Stanley was a graduate of Louisiana Tech and a very proud graduate of Tech, I strongly encourage the Manship School to perhaps waive their role and induct Stanley into the Hall of Fame.
Well, tomorrow night, Jay Shellaby is going to be inducted into the Manship School Hall of Fame. And it takes a little bit of time sometimes. You know, we still don't even have a Joe Burrow statue outside Dodger Stadium. But I guarantee you Stanley will be in the Hall of Fame at some point. I wanted to bring up to the stage now Brad Lichtenstein. He's an award-winning filmmaker. He's been making documentaries since 1998. He's won 2 big DuPont awards. He worked with Stanley when he produced a PBS documentary called American Reckoning about the killing of Natchez civil rights leader Wallace Jackson. Brad's coming up with one of Mr. Jackson's children, Denise Jackson Ford, and Brad is going to speak a minute and play a clip when Stanley sat down with the Jackson family and explained what his findings were in that case. Brad?
There's very little I think I can add to what you learned about Stanley today or knew about Stanley today. I was one of those people starting in 2014 who he was so gracious to, who I asked endless questions of in the case of the murder of Wallace Jackson Sr. And I'm blessed to be joined on stage by Wallace Jackson Jr. and Denise Ford Jackson, who is here with me. I just want to say that Stanley was really available to me at any time and so gracious about also introducing me to these journalists that you've heard today. A lot of this, as you know, started in 2007, 2008. The guy right here, right, so I was a latecomer, and he introduced me to David Ridgen and to Hank Klippenau, to Jerry Mitchell, all the real giants of journalism that you met tonight. I want to share with you a clip from our film American Reckoning, which was on PBS Frontline in 2022. It was nominated for an Emmy. Denise was with me for that. And afterwards, here are a few words from the people that I'm surrounded by about their family and Stanley's work. Thanks.
I heard my mother ask the FBI agents for information all the time. She literally begged them for information on the Wallace case.
Nobody actually openly came out and said, we know who did it. I called and we tried to find out who it was. Nobody ever tell us. Nobody, I never known nothing.
She was looking for some answers. She did come and steal them answers.
press information on the FBI concerning my father's death. They only said things that upset me worse about my father's case. One FBI agent even asked me, do I know who killed my father? Who do I think killed my father? Then I had another tell me, go to Stanley Nelson. Stanley Nelson has produced a lot of information on my father's case.
All right. Haven't seen you in a while. Good to see you.
Doing that,
8 years now, we've been working on these cases. So what I thought I'd do today, I kind of wanted to tell you what I found out about the Silver Dollar Group and about your dad's, the bombing, and just share with you what I believe happened based on the documents and the interviews that I've done. You know, he wasn't just a chance victim. All these people had been murdered before him. All these beatings and all these bombings and all these arsons, and he knew that. And he knew when he took that job what he faced.
So this February day in '67, it's raining. It's rained all day long. At some point, everyone in the know believes that it was Glover. He slips up under that car and he has his C4 explosives and he wires that bomb to the left turn signal of Jackson's car, because when Jackson left, he is going to leave the plant, take a right turn on the Minor Street, and as he gets to a certain point on Minor Street, he's going to turn on his left blinker. Usually at the point he would turn on that left signal, he would be right in the middle of a black neighborhood where more than likely children would be running around and playing. But it just so happened that he got caught into overtime, and so it was 8 o'clock at night, and no one was on the street. Turns that left blinker, blows him out of the car, and he dies right there on the street.
He was a courageous man. Imagine if he were the person that took that job, this white, that had always been a white person's job. It's just an amazing thing that he did that.
Those of us who admire Wallace Jackson, those of us who are proud of the kind of man he was, are gathered here today to extend our comfort to the bereaved family.
I didn't understand why the camera was there. You know, even though we buried my father, I didn't understand the burial.
I just knew that I would never see him again, so.
Maybe at 12, 13. I didn't know what to do. I always said, be strong for your mom and watch out for them. You know, look out for my brothers and sisters.
My son, he was 7 at the time. That next day, I looked at him back in my child, he wasn't around. He went over to play at the truck and they found him. That's where he was. Yes,
I know it's hard, man, but I know you want to know what happened to him.
Worse than that. Ain't no people that cruel, man. Ain't no people that bloodthirsty. I had no idea. How could people sleep at night knowing that they'll kill somebody like that?
Glover died in 1984 in Braintree. All the other ones, one by one, have pretty well, all of these suspects that I've been telling you about, have pretty well died. When they close the case, they're going to send y'all a letter.
They can't close the case.
America don't have to answer for the injustice
that they have also people for many years.
Just watching that clip, I'm reminded all over again, you can see how calm Stanley is, how loving he is in the way that he does his job. And I think as much courage as it takes to also sit on the porch with the Klansmen, it takes courage to sit and hold that kind of presence with people who've lost their father. Like many of us have now lost a father and a friend. And if you guys are willing to just share a couple words about Stanley, I would love
You know, it's a great honor to be here tonight to be in the presence of us celebrating to be a great man, Stanley Nelson, as a journalism. You know, I tell people, you know, it took, my dad was born in '67. No one was ever indicted for his murder. No one could ever share any information with us about his murder. Jerry Mitchell, I know back in the day, he told my mom, you know, I think he kind of knew what was going on. And Jerry Mitchell was just as instrumental and a part of our lives as Stanley Nelson is. And I appreciate Mr. Nelson for the research that he did. He was able to give us names. The FBI agent, the FBI could never tell us anything. The local police of Natchez, Mississippi could never tell us anything. So I appreciate Mr. Nelson for the research that he did to help us with some type of closure in the closing of my father's case. Even though no one would ever be indicted, I tell people all the time, because of the God that I serve, this is my peace in knowing that their lives are worse off than mine. So thank you all.
Like I said, I thank God for Stanley Nelson. It was through Stanley Nelson and his Concordia Syndicate that we found out a lot of the information about our father's death and people surrounding him. It was such a blessing because we hadn't, over 40 years, hadn't heard any information. They kept things underneath the rug concerning that. And when the light was shared on his death, it did a lot for us to find answers. Like I said, I had been with my mother asking FBI agents for information. They would tell my mother, we are there to assist the local authorities. And the local authorities work with us, Klansmen, police, chief of police, sheriff department, city council, so the Bay House plans, but God is greater than all things. And they got by, they didn't get away. Thank God for Stanley Nelson, the information that they gave us, and all of those that were part of it. It was a great inspiration to our family. Thank God for Stanley Nelson.
Stanley produced 2 books. One was Devil's Walking, which was about all the cases we've talked about so far, Frank Morris, Walter Jackson, others. His second book, Clan of Devils, focused on the murder of O'Neill Moore, one of the first black deputy sheriffs in the Bogalusa area. I want to next, the Moore family is here today, but first I want to show you a beautiful video that one of our students, Maddie Pistorius, put together after interviewing Virginia Moore, one of the daughters, and Mayvella Moore, their mom, and I want you, as you watch the video, not only to watch carefully what Virginia has to say the mom taught him, but I want you to watch carefully when Mayvella Moore mentions the moment of weakness she had at one point. Let's play the video.
It never occurred to me that I should be hating someone else because that was not taught to me.
Virginia Morley and her three sisters were raised by a mother who instilled strength in her children.
I just did not get that example of a negative person who was angry. I didn't grow up with that.
It's not good to hate anyone. It's not good at all. I want them to have children, and I want them to instill that in their children.
Mayvella Anna Moore, widow of her late husband, Deputy Sheriff O'Neill Moore, never let her strength waver in front of her children.
That was my main thing in my life, was my children. I always protected my children.
On the night of June 2nd, 1965, Washington Parish Sheriff's Deputy O'Neill Moore and his partner Creed Rogers were gunned down while on patrol, minutes away from O'Neill's home in Barnadoe, around 8 miles outside of Bogalusa, Louisiana. Moore was killed by the unknown assailants. He was the first African-American sheriff's deputy in the parish. After 60 years, 2 federal grand jury cases, and nearly 51 years of FBI investigation, his death remains unsolved and officially closed.
I don't remember the night it happened. I don't remember any emotions around that from people around me. When you don't have something, you don't really know what you're missing. I don't think I knew what to miss because I didn't know what having a father in the house would represent or how that would be different.
Virginia was 7 years old when her father died. Her sisters were equally as young.
People kind of recruited my father and his partner to become deputy sheriffs because they wanted some representation in the parish. That tells me he was an upstanding person. He was well respected, and they had a lot of confidence in him. So I'm proud of that.
Mayvella faced the challenge of adapting to life without her husband.
It impacted her a lot in how she responded in her role as our mother. For years and years and years, she had to put on all the armor and take care of 4 girls on her own. So she was a very, very strong person. But I know that when she found out what had happened, she was destroyed by that. But you don't get to kind of wallow in that kind of thing for a long time. You have 4 children, and you have to move forward. So it made her a really, really tough person. I learned about things later in life that she did because she was angry, but she never, ever shared that anger with us because I don't think she wanted us to be angry people.
It wasn't until the girls were adults that they learned of a situation their mother experienced many years before at the Washington Parish Fair.
Okay, the whites went 3 days. They went Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The blacks they only had 1 day. So I made up in my mind on this Wednesday, I was going to the fair, and I wanted somebody to say something to me. I packed my gun, and my best walking shoe, and I went to the fair, and I wanted somebody to say, "Big dog, why are you out here on Wednesday?" And then after everybody, "Hello, Miss Moore, how you doing?" I walked myself out of the car, so I decided to go home.
Mayvella said leaving that fair was the end of her anger, letting it go. While her pain has never left, the absence of anger is reflected in how she raised her daughters.
Her example for us was probably a very strong person who was very concerned about us and wanting us to be successful and not have us kind of carry the burden of what she actually experienced.
And her girls grew up always keeping that in mind.
I am not angry at anyone. I just feel sad for this life that we have, that there's so much hate. You know, I would like justice, but it's not going to bring my father back, so I don't dwell on it.
Reporting for LSU Cold Case, I'm Madeline Pistorius.
All four of the daughters of Deputy Sheriff O'Neill Moore and Maybella Moore are here tonight with some of their husbands. I'd like to ask them to stand if they could so that we could acknowledge them. I'd also like to ask Maddie Pistorius, who did the video, to stand, as well as Lauren. Madden, who worked with Maddie to talk to the family and do the reporting.
I first met Stanley at the LSU Law School, of all places, in the spring of 2009. He was explaining his journalistic quest of solving cold case murders in the 1960s. Stanley was accompanied by two professors from the University of Syracuse, their own cold case project, who were working informally with him. They were seeking help from LSU in running down leads and conducting interviews in Louisiana and southern Mississippi. There was a list of more than 100 cold cases out there, Klan-related murders, many of them, of course, in southern Mississippi. I was fascinated on several levels and told Stanley that I would stay in touch. He'd talk about understatement. I was eager to join the hunt, but not the way the Syracuse folks had in mind. I approached then Dean Jack Hamilton with a proposal. I was not interested in being a glorified legman for another university program, but how about starting our own cold case project, folding it into an existing field experience class? No added expense, great student experience. Jack just stared at me. So I came a little more passionate. I said, Jack, those horrible acts happened in our backyard, and by God, LSU ought to be the entity to resolve them. With Stanley's encyclopedia experience and expertise, of course, in the background. Jack said, go for it. What Stanley really needed was raw FBI investigative files from the 1960s. It was too costly to have them having sent to him. And so we lodged a Freedom of Information Act request to dispatch student teams every 6 months to Washington, D.C. There they combed the National Archives, photographing things, copying key files, interviewing FBI officials, writing subsequent news stories, creating interactive maps, gathering rare photographs, and Justice Department updates to victims' families. All destined for stories in regional newspapers, for the LSU Cold Case website, and Stanley. Over the first 8 years, we had some 40 students involved in the project. A handful of them are here tonight, this evening. They can start coming up right now. I'm going to relate quickly to some of the things right now. I retired in 2017, and the school hired Chris Drew over there to take my place. And he did take it. Well, it really went well, hiring him, I'll tell you. I found much to admire, Seth, in your grandfather. He was a genuine, well, bless your heart, son of the South. And that was one of his famous longings for our students. We couldn't quite figure that one out. And you know what? He had a very mild, moderate style, as you heard earlier, but he had a camouflaged fire and
subject he was working on. The 24 scariest words, those hiding heinous past, were, "Hi, I'm Stan." I can't do his accent. So. "Hi, I'm Stanley Nelson from the Concordia Sentinel. And I was wondering if you had a little time for a little chat on the front porch." Then he would good old boy the deep secret. You know, I never heard him swear or use an obscene word, and that kind of confused me a bit. He was a good journalist, and I wasn't sure about that. But fortunately, for his professional reputation, he enjoyed a glass of fine bourbon at day's end. I put him back on my radar again. I know he was greeted as a hero in the hereafter, as I know this for a fact, and I can tell you exactly the conversation. "Welcome, Stanley, good and faithful servant. You brought justice to the least of my brethren." And then the next line would be Stanley's. "Well, bless your heart. You know, I would enjoy a little chat one of these days on the front porch if you ever get a moment." So, now let's fire up these students and have them tell you those few things that they remember. And I'm going to keep your voice, Josh. So the first person that we're going to talk about is Matt Albright, who's chief political, he's a political editor actually for the Advocate. He was on the first team that went back. I'm the guy with the mop of hair on the left. Well, that's a picture up there, I think. Yeah. It's one of the things that Matt always remembers about this. I don't know.
So that is standing on the site of Frank Moore's Institution. That is where the story that all of this comes from began. And if you are, yeah, there you go. There we go. I can yell, but not that loud. That is the site of Frank Moore's Institution. And I don't have a terribly good memory, but that picture, that moment is seared in my memory because that is Stanley telling us what happened. This is him saying, they locked the door on him, they threw the flames in there, and it caught on fire, and then he ran over there on fire, and that is where Frank Morse died. You know, I had been in the J school, right? I had sort of understood intellectually what it was going to mean to be a journalist, but to have somebody say, that's where Frank Morse died, and we would never have known that if I had not figured it out. That is a moment that I would say is fundamental to me becoming a journalist, right from the jump.
Will Noble, reporter for the Dallas News, correct? Also, one of my stars. But how about you? You're going to have a little bit of different perspective. Yeah? Most people says as a blessing. Okay, so, Will, you have a little bit of perspective on this. Well, you get out of this, and you're dealing with Stanley and the Cold Case Project.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Good evening, everyone. It's a blessing to be here with you. My condolences and love and respect to Mr. Nelson's family, as well as the Jackson and the Moore family. Meeting Mr. Nelson was such a indescribable experience. I heard someone earlier describe him as a gentle giant. I think that's super accurate. He introduced us to all of his work, and it just left me really speechless. Because it's one thing to go to school and learn about these things happening in your community, and it's another thing to actually have opportunities to interact with people who were living those experiences. It really hit me when we went to the National Archives, when we were going through the different FBI documents, and in one instance, we found just a handful of wires and metal materials, and it clicked in my head, oh my gosh, this was a car bomb. Like, these are materials of a car, and these weapons that are used to assassinate people that look like me. So I I'd always seen and read about it, but I never had that firsthand experience of interacting with people or the materials that were involved in this part of our history. To me, just having that experience helped me realize how Mr. Nelson truly epitomized what it means to be a journalist and a person.
Olivia McClure, sometimes the story got away. One of the big ones was the Brown sisters. We never got up, we never cracked that. Why?
Okay. Well, let me say first who the Brown sisters were. These were 3 sisters who lived around Faraday. They were 12, 14, and 16 years old, I believe. It was said that they had been put into prostitution by their father, and they were raped, killed by Klansmen, and thrown in a lake. And that was about all that was known for a long time. There was a lot of talk, of course, but nothing really ever done officially on the case. And so we were trying to find more out about this, and we were in touch with a relative who was writing a book about this. We wanted to talk, and went up to Monroe to meet with her, and she changed her mind the morning of the interview we had scheduled, and that was it. And that happens on these cases. I'm sure it happened to Stanley. Sometimes people change their mind about wanting to talk about these things because they're so difficult, because they've been left in the past. And sometimes people decide they'd rather leave it there, and you have to respect that. And we were disappointed, of course, not to learn more, but you have to respect the people who are involved in these things, that live in small towns and have to live the realities of the legacy of what happened so long ago.
I forgot to say that Olivia runs the LSU Ag School.
I do not. I just work there.
Well, also people who are reluctant to talk to us because they feel guilty. And one of those stories that we did was on a daughter of a notorious Klansman up in the Faraday area. David LaPlante interviewed a very nervous Deborah Taylor.
Good evening. We're getting the volume right here. So Deborah actually found us, the Cold Case Project, on Facebook, right? And I think my first thought was, she wants to talk about her father. She's been told he's done horrible things. She's heard different things that people would come back and tell her. His friends would tell her. Her mother would tell her. But we thought, we want the victim here. We want crime, right? And I think I could have been more wrong, right? So the more we talked to Deborah, the more we heard from her, we realized how much she was a victim of her father, and just how many victims her father had. And so, unfortunately, we were not able to identify one of those victims. Right? We weren't able to help bring these to the individual families. But I do think that what we were able to share through Deborah's story was just how widespread the damage of the men involved in KKK, the Silver Dollar Group, like her father was, just how many people were impacted by that, right? And how important it was for her story to be told, right? How many, hopefully other people were inspired to speak out, speak up because of what they saw her say. And Jake reminded me earlier this week that story got clicked on a lot of times, right?
And actually, the Advocate hadn't had a story at that point. It had more readership online than this one. It had some capacity, but this was the most popular story, or the most read story, I should say, in the Advocate's digital history up to that point.
Honestly, I think that's more of a credit to the person who writes the headline than it's to the person who writes the story. But what you reminded me was how many people, this is back in the day when people would comment on a story, and a lot of them did, and they were very, very negative, right?
Some were.
A lot of people said that this story should be brought up. It's dredging up old wounds, it's igniting racial tensions, a lot of creative phrases for why this never should have seen the light of day, right?
And it actually, I told her not to read the comments. She was very nervous about it. And I said, don't read the comments. She read the comments.
Well, so I read the comments too. Deborah was texting me about the comments. We're all reading the comments. It's okay, apparently. And started to believe him, right? She started to believe him. Her family was calling her. They were absolutely on the same page as a lot of his commenters. And I started, and I will say that something that inspired me to not believe comments, to understand just how important it was in this story to get out before Deborah, was Stanley's example, right? So Stanley made it very clear, and he inspired a lot of us in this room to understand that these stories not only need to be told, but they need to be heard, right? And I think that all those comments are really just a testament to how many people needed to hear this story. So, glad we're able to get out.
All right, and speaking of digital, we're going to move over to Josh Jackson, who is a professor now at Manchester School of Mass Communications. We did well. He came back and to give back. But in any case, he was involved a lot in the website development and operations, and might tell a little bit about that. And I will tell you that David LaPlante is he's a crisis management expert at a large firm here in public relations.
I think similar to a lot of us here today, I owe a lot of where I am today to Stanley. In the moments that I was able to meet him and interact with Professor Shelley, it's learning that you can be a part of something bigger and that you can put the pieces together to make an impact. Similar to Will, we obviously have a different invested background here. And growing up in Louisiana, there's a lot of stories that are not told. So understanding that I now have an opportunity to be a part of telling these stories and making sure that they, more importantly, live on in that timeline was very important to me. So I remember the summers that I spent while all my friends were sometimes doing internships or sometimes back home with their parents. I was wrist neck deep in the redacted files, scanning the PDFs, uploading them to the website, scanning more PDFs, uploading those to the website, and eventually we finally got that website up and running. It took about 2.5 years to really get it to a place where we liked it. And then I think around 2016, right around the time that I graduated undergrad, that website got hacked and it went down. And we were devastated when that happened. It might have been 2017, a little bit after I graduated, but even then, we were dismayed, but still motivated to rebuild. And luckily, we did. David spoke to the effect of a Facebook page existing. We didn't have that when I was working on the Cold Case Project. So again, just showcasing how much Stanley and this project mean not only to the state of Louisiana, but Mississippi as well, the Gulf South, but us as students collectively. Knowing that this project now lives on and coming back to LSU as a professor, seeing what Chris Drew has done and what these students are doing now. Some of these current Cold Case students are in the room with us. Being a professor and seeing that I had a part in that, and now they're asking me for the same institutional knowledge of what was it like 10 years ago when you were looking at those redacted files, when you had those conversations with Stanley. They want to know. And I think, going back to a conversation that was had earlier, it's very important for us to understand in order to get to where we want to go, we have to understand where we were. And in this current state of America, we have some sort of situation where we tend to want to erase and forget that some things actually happened. I think Stanley was about the opposite. Being bold, being just, accepting that these things did happen. And in order for us to move forward collectively, we have to acknowledge that. So thank you, Stanley's family, for sharing him with all of us. I don't get here without him. I don't get my name in a book inside of Devil's Walking, which is very cool for a 20-year-old to have. I don't get those moments. So thank you for that.
Well, we thank you and bless your hearts.
Okay, before we start to wind down, I just wanted to say that Jay Shelley retired in 2017, and by 2019, Stanley had joined the Manship School formally as an adjunct professor to help me run the LSU Cold Case Project. So things had come full circle at that point. Instead of students supporting his work, he began mentoring some of the students one-on-one. So just briefly, I wanted to introduce 3 of the students who worked the closest with him, and they just wanted to each mention one of the things that they learned from working so close with him. We have Carly Carpenter, Miracle Lewis, and Liz Ryan. Carly?
So I worked really closely with Stanley in 2019 and 2020, going over a lot of files from the FBI, hundreds of pages about Klan violence in Faraday, Louisiana specifically, and the Deacons for Defense and Justice, which is the armed black resistance group that arose in that era to protect black communities and core workers, civil rights workers from the Klan violence. I also spent a summer mentoring with Stanley at the Sentinel some, and you know, everyone is speaking about how Stanley was such a good reporter, he cared about people. That is just the biggest thing about Stanley is his heart. He taught me how to care about people, how to use situations in a very nuanced way. But in addition to that, Stanley was absolutely brilliant. I mean, there are no words to describe how genius he was with how he put everything together. I mean, I would get with him weekly for, gosh, probably a year and a half, 2 years almost, going over all these facts that I learned and hundreds of FBI files I poured over. And although Stanley may not have read all of those files, there was not a fact I presented to him in hundreds and hundreds of pages that Stanley didn't already know. His attention to detail was like none other. He remembered the smallest details about every person, every situation, and every case. His ability to retain it was remarkable, but that all goes to his heart. He cared so much that he wouldn't forget these small details and all the pieces to the puzzle that he needed to put together. And so that's something that stood out the most to me about Stanley. I could go on and on, but yeah.
Okay, so Carly is a lawyer now. You can see she's a great lawyer. Not only does she love the documents that she got from Stanley and the details, but you can see how well she speaks. Thank you, Carly. Erica?
So my name is Miracle Lewis. I work with Stanley for the Milton Scott case. From 2022 to 2023, that was a very multifaceted story, had a lot of racial undertones with a black Muslim who was shot and killed by 2 white FBI agents in South Baton Rouge, honestly not too far from LSU. And we're hearing a lot of people talking about how Stanley really poured his all into these stories that he told, but I think it's also crucial to continue to emphasize the care that he had for his students, in which I was one of them. At the time, I only had about a year and a half of experience within journalism, maybe, and having the idea that this is a very male-dominant, white-centered field, and I had a lot of self-doubts about the things that I was doing with this 50-year-old case that was very prominent and which I had never ever heard about as a Baton Rouge native. Stanley never made me feel like a student that didn't have a voice, despite the fact that he had years of experience over me. He really took each and every suggestion that I had to heart, and he allowed me to develop and follow my journalism instincts under his mentorship. It's just, I mean, everybody's talking about how Stanley was just this calm presence, and he just really was. I mean, even if I came to him about so many different approaches to a story or a hurdle that I didn't understand or how to get over it, he was just very steady. In fact, I don't even remember if Stanley's voice went over a certain octave. He just had a very steady flow to the way he talked. His cadence was just reassuring. So, I mean, we just combed over hundreds of FBI documents, and he walked me through each and every one of those pages. I don't know, Stanley, I would really just appreciate him. I'm looking at the family, I'm hoping you guys are taking everything well, and I just appreciate you guys for being here and allowing me to speak on his behalf, because he really made a great impact on my life as a journalist. He really, really deeply cared for history and making sure that it was portrayed accurately and all the aspects were there, and so I learned that from him. And that's what stood out to me and still stands out to me to this day.
Miracle is now a reporter for the Telegraph in Macon, Georgia. Liz Ryan.
Stanley taught us so much. I worked with him on the Robert Fuller case, where Robert Fuller, who rose to Klan leadership, had murdered 4 of his black employees. And with Stanley's patient guidance and coaching, he helped us to find people and to find documents. With his help, we were able to find Willie Mae Pitts Salih, the woman on the left, who was the older sister of 2 of the men murdered by Robert Fuller, and the woman on the bottom in front of the organ, who was also 94, who was a neighbor of Robert Fuller. And really, it was Stanley's coaching that helped us find both these women. He also really helped us to find documents. And I remember this one time, I was frustrated. The clerk's office told me, we don't have these coroner's records, you can't get them here. And so I told Stanley this, and he was like, why don't you call that clerk back? And why don't you offer to look in her basement? And I'm like, basement? He said, she doesn't even know what's down there. And so I call this clerk, and she's like, I'm new here. I don't know what's in my basement. Let me have my staff look, and I'll call you back. 2 hours later, she calls me back, and she found those documents in that basement. I was like, Stanley, he knew, right? He got a tip. We did a 4-part series, and then he got a tip from Ben Greenberg, who I know is somewhere in the audience. Ben, hey, thank you. He called Stanley and said, hey, there's this other guy who was friends with the 4 men who were killed, who wasn't there that day. And I think I have his phone number. And so we tried calling this guy, and couldn't get him. And Stanley, I talked to him, he's like, you gotta go knock on the door. And thanks to Stanley's coaching, we found this guy, and that headline was Stanley's suggestion on the headline. But I want to tell one other story about Stanley. Every time we would go out into the field and interview people, he would say, get pictures. I mean, you'd talk to him 5 times about the interview, and he'd call you specifically to say, don't forget to get pictures. So I was like, got it, okay. But then Stanley himself did not want any pictures of Stanley, right? So we had hardly any photos on the LSU Cold Case Project website. So one day, I'm in Faraday at the library with Stanley, we're going over the cold case files. We're gonna be there all week, and Chris Drew calls up and says, hey Liz, make sure you get some photos of Stanley with the files. I'm like, got it, okay. So every day I keep asking Stanley, hey, can I get a picture? He's like, oh, we'll do that later. So it's like Thursday, and I look at him, and I'm like, I pull out my camera, I take my glasses off, right? I get my camera, and I'm like, hey Stanley, let me take a photo. He looks at me and he goes, hang on a minute. Gets his pen out, and he writes something down on a piece of paper, and he holds it up. Now, I have my camera, and I don't have my glasses on, so I can see through the lens, but I don't know what he's written on the paper. But I'm thinking, I better take this fast, because he looks like he's got a big smile on his face, and this is a great photo for the front of the LSU Cold Case Project website. So I take the photo, and then I put the camera down, and I put my glasses on, and I'm like, hey Stanley, can I see what's on that paper? This is what was on the paper. And I'm like, does that say help on it? Stanley, I can't put that on the LSU Cold Case Project website. So every time needless to say, it's not on the website, but every time I look at it, I laugh because it reminds me of Stanley's great sense of humor, and it's a reminder that every once in a while we need to laugh, even in the face of difficult work, and to take pictures along the way to remember moments like this. Thank you.
And while Liz is here, I wanted to say she spent a lot of time with Stanley. She spent 3 weeks in a B&B in Natchez once at her own expense. She spent another week with him inventorying all our files. And he would be very happy to know that she is now going to work with us and help me run the Cold Case Project and fill a little bit of the gap he left. Okay, I just wanted to show a slide. He's won a national award for one of our projects. This brief examination of the 1972 killings of 2 Southern students at a campus protest. It led Governor John Bell Edwards to apologize to the victims' family on behalf of the states. It also led to the students winning a national award from the Investigative Reporters and Editors Group. now also doing podcasts and videos as well as written stories with everything we do. So as we wrap up, one of the documentary producers and podcast creators, he was absolutely closest to Stanley, probably one of his closest friends, David Ridgen. He really wished he could be here. He couldn't get here. He sent a 50-second clip with just a message for everyone. We wanted to play that.
This is important to me because
Hi there everyone, David Ridgen here. I'm very sorry I couldn't be there right now with you all to think about and memorialize our friend and colleague Stanley. I've struggled daily since we lost him. He was one of my best friends. He supported my every move for some reason. Well, we supported each other. He just got me. We had a lot in common, but we were also very different. Lots of laughs together. We were working on a number of ongoing projects together, long-term civil rights era cases and stories, none of them funded by anyone, probably ever, but all with the aim of publication somewhere. The journey of them seemed to be the point, in retrospect. It's such a small community of people working in this area, and that island that we're on seems to be getting smaller and smaller, but in very short spurts, we did a ton of work.
And then, just as far as the impact of Stanley's work, did David Wadley make it here? David Wadley was trying to come. He was one of the deacons. He was integrated in Faraday High School. The Klan tried to bomb his house. Luckily, it didn't detonate. But at one point, Deborah Taylor, the son of Klansman Stanley, the son of a Klansman, Sonny Taylor, met with David Wadley and apologized on behalf of what her father had done because he was behind trying to bomb the house. We had a picture of them together. And we also wanted to play a quick clip. A couple of our students, current students, Isaiah and Michaela, just went to Natchez just for a very quick visit with Roscoe Barnes, the historian there. And let me just play that one clip.
This is important to me because so much of my work, is based on books, articles. But now to have some people who can describe it, I thought, okay, we need to do something with this.
That was the reaction of Dr. Roscoe Barnes to meeting new witnesses of the bombing of George Natchez, a cold case that happened no more than 50 years ago in Natchez, Mississippi. This attack and the bombing of Warden Jackson, not too long after, have long been subjects to Dr. Barnes' research on the crimes of the Ku Klux Klan, also known as the KKK. He says, however, that this finding will bring peace and balance to the community.
So Natchez is officially on the Freedom Trail, on the Civil Rights Trail. And this was the first marker. I think it was in 23 when we got it approved. So the front, Freedom Trail markers, the front gives you a paragraph, and of course I wrote all the text. On the back, you have photos.
Barnes' discovery is just one of the few historical treasures of Natchez that bring the community together.
And these are some of the original deacons that you see. We were able to get some of their photos. The one at the top is James Jackson. He was the president.
The efforts of historian Dr. Barnes, combined with the investigative journalism of the late Stanley Nelson, have helped shape Natchez into the community it is today, honoring all of its past.
So what was hidden history that people hated to see Stanley exposed is now acknowledged in these towns. And I'd like to invite the families of Stanley Nelson, O'Neill Moore, and Morris Jackson to just come up on the stage for a final acknowledgement from everyone. And we'll hear briefly from Stanley's daughter, Tessa Nelson Ranger.
Chris. Hi, I'm Tessa. I'm Stanley's daughter. Nick, my brother. Everything else said today about him is true. He could disarm me within a few seconds. A couple of weeks before he passed, he was sick, but I went in the house, I had something on my mind, and it was just really bothering me. He immediately knew what to say to get me to talk and open up. That's just the kind of person he was, and the kind of dad he was too. And I just want to say thank you all to everyone who came out. Thank you to LSU, Manship School, Chris Drew. This has been really hard to lose him suddenly, and thank you for such good help. It's really hard. So I just appreciate it, and we're in awe of all this. We're in awe of all that he did. We really didn't know how much he was appreciated on a national level. I did decide with the family that the right thing to do with his research was to donate it to LSU's Cold Case Project for Manship School. Because he loved his students, he loved the work he did, and in the beginning, I think when he saw Frank's name on that list, I don't know, I think it was just the right thing to do, and I think he was just trying to tell the truth, and at first we really were hoping for justice, but we quickly saw that it was about the truth. And I think Greg Isles said this about him, that he had the most finely calibrated sense of right and wrong of any human being he'd ever met. That was exactly true about him. So I just want to say thank you all, Chris and Liz, who've been like family since this has happened. They've been with me. And I want to thank the Hannahs too, because without their gifts early on, we wouldn't be here. So I want to thank y'all too for that. Thank y'all.
We want to thank you all for coming. We appreciate your coming, and Stanley deserved it. We're happy to do it for him. Thank you. We also want to thank Sarah and her whole staff here, and it's just such a beautiful space. Thank you.
I'm Mary DeRusso on behalf of Secretary of State Nancy Landry. I want to thank you all for coming. I am privileged to say that Stan and Nancy and I were part of the tech, and Bobby Lamb and Jamie Segura, who was here earlier. He's out there now. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for supporting this work. The Old State Capitol is proud that our mission is to teach people about democracy and to inspire engaged citizenship. So come often. Thank you so much.